Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, a podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 227, Antietam, Burnside's Bridge. Last episode, we went over Stoneman's 1865 raid. This was an action that helped to speed the conclusion of the war. While it's not normally in the forefront of our minds when we think about those 1865 actions that lead to the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia, and then, of course, Joseph Johnston surrendering most of the Confederate Army thereafter at Bennett's Place, it does actually play a pretty significant role in that. This week, we will take a different approach and really focus in on one area of a particular battle. We're going to Antietam, and we're going to just be talking about the action at Burnside's Bridge. Before we do that, though, let's talk about some Patreon content. And, of course, we have coming up here a movie review. We did Emancipation, this most recent movie here from Will Smith, who stars in that. And it depicts some action at Port Hudson. So, not usually a place where you see Civil War action being depicted. So we talked about that movie. We're going to go back to a memoir review coming up, and this is going to be about scouting and being a scout. So that is going to be a little bit different than some of these other memoir reviews we've done before. We've done infantry, we've done partisan ranger, we've done artillery, cavalry. Now we're going to go into scouting. So it's another lane in which we just haven't been able to cover yet. So if any of that sounds like it would interest you, whether it's a movie review, memoir review, picture slideshows, any of our other content. We just did a fantasy draft for our generals. There is a link in the show description, and those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. So when we talked about the Battle of Antietam in our narrative episodes, our main narrative episodes, I think we did overall a good job of laying out the battle. However, I noticed when I went back and took a look at the script, I think there was definitely a slight bias toward the other main sectors of the field. We talked about the cornfield and the sunken road, and in comparison, we kind of glossed over the bridge over Antietam Creek, which bears the name now of Ambrose Burnside. One type of segment I figured we could roll out moving forward is to go back and take a more in-depth view on certain areas of larger battles. While I have a couple of spots in mind to maybe dive deeper, I think a fitting place to start would be Antietam, as it is September. To set the stage, though, let's briefly run down the events leading to the battle. If you recall, the Army of Northern Virginia is going to invade Maryland, following two successful campaigns for Lee. He had bested McClellan in the 7 Days, and then struck at John Pope in the Second Manassas campaign. As in a whole, we have Cedar Mountain, we have Second Manassas, and then we also have Chantilly, two of those being smaller battles. Second Manassas might have been one of Lee's better victories. Riding high off of that success, Lee would wish to move the war into the north and maybe shift the foreign opinion on the Confederacy. Trying to wage the conflict not on Southern soil was always a big goal for the Gray Fox. Abraham Lincoln is going to turn back to George B. McClellan to lead the Union forces. Fortunately for Little Mac, an extra copy of Lee's plan had been left behind by D.H. Hill's troops, meaning he knew exactly where the rebel infantry was. While Jackson successfully forces the capitulation of Harper's Ferry, the Army of the Potomac would strike the rebels at South Mountain. This might have been the best performance for Little Mac, the passes of South Mountain being secured. Lee would have to set up defensively and hope he could consolidate his forces to meet the much larger Federal Army. He would select Sharpsburg, which sat across Antietam Creek, as his rally point, and the point he could wait for the northern host. McClellan, in the meantime, would act on the offensive on the 17th, which included shuffling pieces on the board and Robert E. Lee having to shift forces to meet the threats. McClellan actually does a good job in responding quickly to the threat of a Confederate invasion into Maryland. Even Robert E. Lee will admit that he was kind of surprised. Even without the infamous orders falling into his lap, Little Mac behaves differently than he does in previous campaigns. I know we mentioned we would focus on Burnside's Bridge, but this leads me to 2 points I'd like to throw out that maybe we should consider to the campaign overall. One is that it might very well have ended without Antietam. Lee scatters his army and is able to scrape it together enough to fight McClellan, and that gives him breathing room to get into Virginia. You could argue, though, that once South Mountain occurs, we could easily just have seen a move back into Virginia, as this was sort of the plan. Lee doesn't want to abandon part of his forces to save the whole. Had McClellan acted a little bit sooner, he might have been able to press the issue, but there is something to be said also of wanting to have all your forces available and ready to meet Robert E. Lee, who is already proven to be quite the dangerous general, so we can't necessarily be too harsh on McClellan in that case. Point number 2 is actually fairly important for anyone who's critical of McClellan, is that while he does take over the army once again, he's really only familiar with a small portion. So for those who like to flip-flop on whether the 5th Corps should have been fully engaged, we know that they are not entirely idle, as some might believe. Remember, too, that he actually knows that organization, and McClellan probably rightly thinks of them as one of the better combat forces. An old guard, if you will, if we're talking about Napoleon. And, much like Napoleon, he is going to hold his old guard to be used at the last. So whether that's in an instance where he needs to throw them into the battle at hand, or whether he needs to hold them in reserve to save his army, or whether he needs to hold them in reserve to fight another day, those are all options that are on the table for George B. McClellan. Remember, too, that the 5th Corps had done the lion's share of some of the work in the 7 days. They had been at Mechanicsville. They had been at Gaines's Mill. They had been again at Malvern Hill. So they had done a good job in fighting defensive battles against Robert E. Lee. That right now, they're going to be combat veterans. They had just fought at Second Manassas as well, so they're going to be a kind of trump card in reserve should McClellan really need it. But overall, these 2 points are just food for thought. One of the big reasons for Robert E. Lee to invade Maryland was the question of supply. The campaigning had been heavy in the earlier parts of 1862. First, Lee had to check McClellan at the gates of Richmond. We have talked before about how one of the things that the Gray Fox does prior to taking the reins is vector in troops. He does a good job of this prior to First Manassas as well. The support of the southeast of the Confederacy would be crucial to this, the coastal states hanging on to a large number of troops to check against potential threat of the U.S. Navy and an invasion to their ports. Alexander Lawton's Georgia Brigade is an example I have thrown out before of them being at a division strength during the Battle of Gaines's Mill, but by the time we get to the end of the year, this is definitely not the case. We then have the campaigning for Second Manassas, culminating once again in one of Lee's greater victories, and as a result, moving into Maryland, we have some pretty striking descriptions of the Southern forces. The troops would be raggedy in appearance. One Georgian would write of how he fights Second Manassas with one shoe and would take the opportunity to relieve a dead Union soldier of his footwear at the first opportunity. This would have been a member of Robert Toombs's Peach Staters. Toombs had been a politician from Georgia prior to the conflict and would be a checkered general. Originally, he had been perhaps slated for Confederate politics, but Toombs would be an aggressive battlefield commander, serving under Magruder and Jones's division. He would get into hot water, though, a miscommunication leading to his troops uncovering Raccoon Ford, which almost leads to the capture of Jeb Stuart. Remember that famous incident where Jeb Stuart loses some of his clothing, some of his stuff, and then, he wants to try to return the favor as part of the Jeb Stuart kind of cavalier legend. Marching into Maryland, the depleted ranks would be much the same state as the rest of the Army of Northern Virginia for Toombs's Georgians. He would indeed have a key subordinate in Henry Benning serving under him, though. Benning had been given the nickname Rock at Thoroughfare Gap, commanding Toombs's brigade while the general was on the bench following the incident at Raccoon Ford, and also wanting a duel with D.H. Hill. Which, if you know anything about D.H. Hill, if you've heard me talk about D.H. Hill before, apparently he was not easy to get along with, so I'm not particularly surprised that Toombs would want to duel him. Toombs and his Georgians would arrive in Sharpsburg early, missing out on the South Mountain engagements. As such, they would start to form an anchor to Lee's line, as also securing the retreat line for reinforcement. Lee had a good idea to save his army by setting up aggressively on high ground on the other side of Antietam Creek before Sharpsburg. Toombs would have his command protecting the rightmost bridge crossing the creek, the Rohrbrock Bridge, named as such for a farm nearby. The National Road led here a rock quarry showing a sharp bluff. From this high ground, protected by thin woods, the Georgians would make their defense. They would check not only the Rohrbruch crossing, but also have to guard against the approaches from Snavely Ford, which was further south along the creek. They would be joined by South Carolina sharpshooters and 2 pieces of the Washington artillery. All in all, there would be around 300 defenders for the bridge that would soon have the name Burnside. The Union Army facing Toombs and his small force would be the 9th Corps. Now, as we discussed earlier in our narrative episodes, originally we had the structure of different groups or wings. However, this is going to be scrubbed. Ambrose Burnside would be upset that Joe Hooker had been removed from under his supervision, but the extent to this dissatisfaction is often blown out of proportion. As such, Jacob Cox would be over the 9th Corps, and Burnside would only have this to supervise. Thus, there would be an unnecessary chain in the communications with Burnside, only having this 9th Corps to worry about. Although, again, it is questionable as to what the extent of this kind of over-communication would be. I've seen it actually pointed out that if Burnside is just sitting there with Jacob Cox, then there's really not a detriment to the actual chain of command because Burnside is hearing every single piece of information that Jacob Cox is hearing. Jacob Cox is the one who is then going to kind of be the operational control of the situation, but he's just getting the okay from Burnside. So I've seen it kind of described by that, and that doesn't sound necessarily like it would be too much of a hassle. What something else was that I believe we talked about in our narrative episodes is that the battle would indeed unfold on the left and in the center. McClellan would be for sure ready to launch this attack, acting on the offensive. The Union left would thus be a kind of a backwater, with McClellan operating fairly far from the battlefield, only occasionally getting close to the action. Then it would be a huge stack of factors against immediate action at Rohrbruch Bridge. This is always a tough look with some misconceptions on the Union side. Burnside was indeed offered command of the army and does some good commanding at South Mountain. Jacob Cox does succeed Jesse Reno, who's mortally wounded at that action, and there's always a part of why Burnside remains in this weird position of not fully commanding the Corps, as his wing had been removed, and while Cox offers it back to his superior, Burnside is not going to want to take it, as he sees this as a step back. We've seen that before a couple times, notably when we talked in 1864 about how George Gordon Meade is tabbed with maybe leading what becomes Sheridan's Valley Army, then that is actually kind of seen as sort of an insult to him, as kind of a step backwards. So there's this kind of, again, honor system amongst these guys that's going to keep them from doing that. Much like James Longstreet at Gettysburg, I think there's really a lack of evidence, though, to support that Burnside was dragging his feet, kind of throwing a temper tantrum as a result of the situation that he was in at Antietam. As mentioned, on September 17th, the main forces would be on the Confederate left and center. Crossing of the Antietam at Rohrbruch Bridge would be on the back burner for McClellan, especially as the battle raged around the cornfield and the Dunkard Church. An attack might have jumped off earlier in the day, however, Hood launches his famous counterattack and creates a real problem for the North. More troops were being deployed to stabilize the situation up there. As a result, the order to attack would be delayed. Burnside would not get his okay to move until around 10 a.m. In a battle where the timetable is going to be important and the small delays are going to be an issue, then we're going to have some problems. It is true that Lee is forced to remove some of the potential supporting units from this area, so the defenders in numbers get down to our approximate 300. With that, though, we should point out that a big myth is that you can just walk across the creek anywhere. The creek was deep enough and swift enough to make the crossing of a Civil War soldier quite difficult. If there were Confederates on the high ground on the other side of the waterway, then shooting at a Civil War soldier with all his gear and trying to keep his powder dry is going to be even more difficult. As such, it would be necessary to cross in an appropriate area. Rohrbruch Bridge and Snavely Ford would be two areas that would be necessary avenues in order to accomplish the goals that the Union Army had for this left wing. There had been some skirmishing on the 16th between the two sides. Remember that Antietam is technically a 2-day affair in some sense. Absence of federal cavalry, though, would lead there to be a deficit in intel in the sector. McClellan, keen to attack the Confederates, was holding cavalry in reserve to drive home his victory in a Napoleonic swoop. But this would mean that the infantry would have to recon by themselves, and so Snavely Ford would be neglected, and yet part of the larger plan to get to the rebels in this sector at the same time. For all the Union troops know, there is a much larger Confederate force there to check them. At Roebuck Bridge, the terrain is going to assist in a defense. A combination of the high ground and a good shooting gallery would make the prospect difficult for just marching across. Burnside and Cox would have divisions under Orlando Wilcox, Samuel Sturgis, Isaac Peace Rodman, and Eliakim Scannum, this being of the West Virginia element of the Ninth Corps, which is going to include George Crook and his brigade. It would be his Ohio regiments which would be charged with the first attempt at the bridge. In the meantime, Rodman would be sent to the location of Snavely Ford and fight the Confederates. Sturgis's men would be held next in line to try at the bridge. Sturgis would have brigades under James Nagle and Edward Ferraro. Henry Kingsbury and his 11th Connecticut would be the lead regiment to move on the bridge, Crook's brigade forming up behind them. The 11th would move out from two knolls and some tree cover to relatively open ground and make a dash at the crossing. The Georgians, though, were ready and had even dispatched sharpshooters to move into the trees on their side of the creek to deliver even more effectual fire. The 11th Connecticut would lose a third of their strength in the assault. To illustrate the treacherous passage that was the creek, the Nutmeg Staters would try to bypass the bridge and make it over the waterway on either side, but they would be bogged down and sustain heavy casualties in this attempt. Henry Kingsbury would be mortally wounded in this part of the action. So this is something that I don't know if I necessarily picked up on or really highlighted there in our main narrative episode. I think really, unfortunately, I didn't really spend a whole lot of time on the actual Burnside's Bridge portion of the action, and that's why, of course, we're going back and redoing this episode, but it's one of the things that you kind of point out to, in that if you go to Antietam and you look at the creek and you're like, man, somebody could just walk across. Well, they tried that, right? You know, the 11th Connecticut certainly tries that, and they're not going to succeed because they're taking a lot of fire. If you actually go and stand on the one side of the bridge and kind of look back to where the Confederates are, you just see, even in the modern sense, how a formidable position that it would be. So, you know, that's just one of the things that you kind of point out to when you dig a little bit deeper into the action. Crook's Ohio regiments would be next in line, and they would attack in the same way, being repulsed. We actually have an account from a Georgia soldier. At the bridge on the Antietam Creek, our regiment and the 20th Georgia, in all amounting not over 300 muskets, held them in check for 4.5 hours. Then we fell back, only because our ammunition was exhausted, though we suffered badly. 8 cannon just 500 yards off were pouring grape shot, shell, and canister into our artillery, could not silence them. We held our post until Major Harris ordered us to fall back. Our Colonel Holmes was killed about half an hour before. He was as brave a man as I ever saw. He was perfectly cool and calm, and showed that he did not know what the word danger meant. He had won the confidence of the regiment at the Battle of Manassas. Poor man, he was pierced by 3 balls after he received his death wound. We could not bring his remains off the field. 3 men tried, and 2 of them were shot. I wanted to go with them, but I knew it was not right to expose myself in that way. Colonel Holmes was dead, and it was not right for us to risk our lives simply to get his body off the field. Major Harris is a brave man, but I don't think it's quite cool enough. He was struck on the arm, but the ball did not enter, only gave him a pretty bad bruise. We went into the fight with only 89 muskets, and had 8 officers and 35 men killed and wounded. So many of the dead were shot down that the officers filled their pieces and loaded and fired their guns. I fired only once, and that was at a bunch of 6 or 7 Yankees not more than 60 yards off. The musket was a smoothbore, unloaded with ball and 3 buckshot. I won't say whether I hit the mark or not. Mother, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. So a couple things to take away is that it's becoming quite a hot place for the Georgians, so it's not going to be necessarily a cakewalk. It's not easy, because they're taking a lot of fire from the other side of the bridge. And obviously, you're taking cover, whether it's at the creek bed or around there's these walls that are right there at the bridge, or it's artillery, right? So there's all kinds of different ways in which you could be receiving fire if you are the Confederates. The other thing I do want to mention, and the reason why I included this quote to highlight just how deadly it was for the Union attackers, is that if you did have a smoothbore weapon that is buck and ball, that's almost the perfect weapon to use if you are having a congestion point, say a bridge, where individuals are having to cross. Because remember, a buck and ball is going to have one smooth bore, right? So it's going to be one round ball, but it's also going to have this buckshot that comes with it. So that's going to be that much more effective against clusters of the enemy. In this part of the fighting, it was assumed that Rodman would be easily able to get to the ford, and then move across and flank the Georgians out of their strong position. But the going was going to be slow for Rodman, and Palmetto sharpshooters would be sprinkled on the rebel side of the creek, making the going difficult. It also needs to be pointed out that Rodman doesn't know exactly where Snavely Ford is, right? So if you don't know exactly where you're going or where it is, and you're taking fire from the other side, and even though it's only a handful of sharpshooters, it could be the skirmishers of a larger body of troops. You just don't know. And without the cavalry to be the eyes in this situation, they're not going to be able to give reliable intel that is going to be turned into actionable intel, and then they're going to be able to then attack across the ford. Samuel Sturgis would be next to try on the bridge. His directive would be different. With Rodman delayed, but hopefully pulling defenders from Roebuck Bridge, he's going to be tasked with taking it directly, with an actual assault. Before these attacks at the bridge are going to be more of a diversion. If you're able to carry it by force, then yes, but you're really just kind of waiting around and for Rodman to show up, and that's going to be the easiest course of action, right? Like if you don't have a whole lot of defenders, if he's showing up with his entire division, he's going to be able to probably clear those defenders away long enough for a beachhead to then be established. You're able to cross the rest of your forces. The 2nd Maryland would lead the way, followed by the 6th New Hampshire, 9th New Hampshire, and 48th Pennsylvania. Supported by artillery fire, they would push out and try out for a fence that would then lead to a road to approach the bridge. Their tearing down of the fence would create not only a pause, but also additional bottlenecks that would see the Georgians exploit, taking casualties still in their effective fire. We have an account from the 2nd Maryland. We're going to pick this one up here in the middle of the account. Well, Sturgis says, there is a bridge around the other side of this hill, and the Lieutenant Colonel of the 6th New Hampshire thinks his regiment too small to head the assault onto it, so I offer it to you. All right, General, says Duryea. I'll make a try for that star anyhow. So he took the head of the regiment and followed it down to the gulch to the river bottom. I followed along. As we got to level ground on the border of the stream, the bridge was in sight, to the right, some 200 or 300 yards off. The regiment flanked off across some plowed ground toward the bridge, the colonel at the head, pulling down fences. On the opposite side of the stream, some 100 yards off or so, the bank rose perpendicular some 20 or 30 feet, and had been dug out on the right side of the bridge end for the road, which came from the right of it. The crest of the opposite bank was fringed with bushes, and some willow and other trees also grew there. These bushes concealed from sight the enemy, who were laying there waiting till their fire would tell the best. I was taking observations for a place for the wounded, and noticed a barn built of round poles and covered with thatch just to the left of me, and a pool of good-looking water just in front. I unhitched my tin cup and stooped to take a drink of water, just as the instant the enemy poured in their volley. It seemed so comparatively still before that, but now it seemed as if all the noises in the world had broken out at once. The batteries were pretty close down on both sides, and they all opened. I noticed some splendid practices of our batteries, their shells bursting just as the willows and limbs of them dropping into the stream, cutting off their fragments. The regiment, still moving by flank, and this time all alone, was stopped to throw down the fence on the other side of the field. Duryea had just thrown down the RAS rail as he looked back, and saw the regiment shrinking, and elbowing out under this tremendous fire, ready just to break. The plowed furrows which thickly dotted the fallen men, when down the line came his peculiar, keyed voice, which could be and was heard through that infernal noise. What the hell are you doing there? Straighten that line there, forward. The line straightened, like straining your arm, and on it went for the bridge. I was now busy getting the wounded to the barn, but learning afterward that he could not get to the bridge and have any men left. So about 30 or 40 yards from it, he halted and faced his men, and they commenced returning the enemy's fire. The action, so far as we were concerned, began around 11 a.m., for I was looking at my watch just before I went down, and it was just 11. About 2, we had finished dressing in all the barn and provided for them as well we could. I went out to look around. The firing had held up in our vicinity and gone over to the other side of the river. On going toward the bridge, I saw bad signs for the 2nd. There were dead men all along the row, and up at the head lay the adjutant and numbers of others. Just behind was a farm road, and in this I found what was left of it resting. My friend Captain Wilson was killed, a cannon shot striking in the forehead and carrying away the top of his head. There were 400 in line that morning, and 150 had been killed or wounded. So that just gives us another idea of just how difficult it was to assault the bridge. After the Maryland Regiment's failure, they would take cover and trade fire with the rebels. The 6th New Hampshire would likewise attempt the bridge. We do have an account of their attack as well. With fixed bayonets, a double quick, they passed through a narrow opening in a strong chestnut fence, which there was no time to remove, and charged in the most gallant manner directly up the road to the bridge. As the attacking party, led by Colonel Griffin, debouched from the field into the road, the rebels, from their entrenched position, redoubled the fury of their fire, sweeping the head of the column with murderous effect. Of the first 100 men who passed through the opening in the fence, at least 9/10 were either killed or wounded. Such sweeping destruction checked the advancing column, but the men sheltered themselves behind logs, fences, and whatever cover they could find, and bravely held the ground already gained. The remaining regiments would pull off in their headlong assaults, Sturgis unable to push through the bridge in the Confederate defense, allowing for Wilcox to cross and hopefully link up with Rodman. Amazingly, Toombs would receive no ammunition from Lee, nor any reinforcement. For 3 hours, the Confederates had held off the enemy. With a determined defense, though, it became apparent that the Southerners would need to make their shots count, and likewise, there was bound to be a renewed effort, this time with the resolution that the bridge would need to be taken at all hazards. Edward Ferrara would be tagged with this. Ferrara had done well at Second Manassas recently in helping to stem the tide of the Confederate final assault, and now he would be given an even tougher task. He would look to his 51st Pennsylvania and the 51st New York to get the job done, the 51st New York having in their ranks the brother of Walt Whitman. Following them would be the 21st and 35th Massachusetts. John Hartranft would be commanding the 51st Pennsylvania and would serve as the ranking officer during the assault. Hartranft, as we know, is going to rise to division command in the 9th Corps, serving all the way to Petersburg. He would bicker with Ferrara about the attack, knowing full too well that the attack would see heavy casualties. Once jumped off, the regiments would indeed suffer. We do have an account of their attack. Not hesitating to obey an order which they knew to be will of McClellan and the direct command of Burnside, through Sturgis and Ferraro, the regimental commanders moved without hesitation, and the men at once followed example. Those in the advance saw that they had nothing to rush upon and overwhelm, and naturally desired in self-defense for the purpose of doing what service they could, to load and fire, as often as any single enemy was to be seen. For nothing like an uncovered rank of rebels was discernible, or indeed existed. Those of our troops not in the advance crossed somewhat upon those in front, and the whole column while on the bridge appeared like an irregular mob, moving nervously, but at a snail's pace, toward the enemy. The unencumbered motions of a tired soldier are distressingly feeble in appearance. So there was much want of all bounding energy in all these movements. But there was no turning back. And while there was, to the view, one upon the spot, a patient endeavor to do the most harm to the enemy by the employment of all skill which drill and service had taught those veterans, the column kept up its snail's pace, passed the bridge, took the road to the right, till it was clear of the bridge, and then, being out of ammunition, or nearly so, took position on the sloping bank of the creek, probably to escape the inflating fire down the road. The rebels were posted behind trees and natural projections of the rocky, wooded covered slope along the brow of the slope, behind little curious shelters made of rails in the form of small lunettes, and provided with loopholes, and a few caissons up in the trees, all acting like riflemen. They had wounded many upon the knolls, left the effect of their fire along the low land near the road, and galled the assailants of the bridge a good deal, almost without being seen. Probably 200 might have been able the sum of the infantry in the force there. No use for more. It was impossible for them to plant a canyon so as to fire lengthwise of the bridge. Physically impossible, and nobody feared it. So obviously, this is going to be from a Massachusetts man's perspective. The 51st Pennsylvania and 51st New York are going to be the ones who are going to carry the bridge here. And they're going to be able to get into a position where they're able to trade fire with the enemy. And then, obviously, as mentioned, the Confederates are running low on ammunition at this point, so they're just not going to be as effective as they had been earlier in the action. A final concentrated effort past 1 p.m. would see the Union forces, still taking losses, get across the creek and capture some of the advanced defenders. The final push for the attackers at the bridge would be supported by Rodman finally getting across the creek, skirmishing with the 50th Georgia, and sharpshooters posted to watch this approach. Led by the 9th New York, they would be able to flank the 2nd and 20th, still posted at the bridge. By this time, the casualties had been heavy for the rebels. Toombs would write in his report of the decision to retreat. Not being able to get in reinforcements for the defense of these two fords, and seeing that an enemy was moving upon them to cross, thus enabling him to attack my small force in front, right flank and rear, and my two regiments having been constantly engaged from early in the morning up to 1 o'clock, with a vastly superior force of the enemy, aided by 3 heavy batteries, the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Holmes, of the 2nd having been killed in the action, and the only remaining field officer, Major Harris, being painfully wounded, and fully 1/2 of this regiment being killed and wounded, and the 20th having also suffered severely and killed and wounded, and the ammunition of both regiments being nearly exhausted, and Eubanks Battery having been withdrawn to the rear only 2 hours before, I deemed it my duty, in pursuance of your original order, to withdraw my command. The Georgians had held off the entire 9th Corps and had inflicted some 900 casualties on the attackers in the process. As we had mentioned before, the timetable of this battle is super important, right? So the ability for this small number of troops to hold off such a larger number is going to play that much more havoc on the plans of the Union. It's going to play into the plan of Lee, and it's a necessary gamble, right? If the 9th Corps is going to show up in the morning at Sharpsburg, then things could have been really bad for the Confederates, right? You have barely enough troops to be combating in the north, and then when the sunken road position breaks, you're kind of relying essentially on artillery and some scrambled together units to then stop that, right? So you don't have any more men that you could send to this location if Burnside is able to get across the creek. So just the fact that the Georgians are able to hold on as long as they did is in many ways really the key to how the battle turns out. As we may have mentioned in the narrative episodes, the Battle of Antietam has a rumor where Burnside was inadequate in this part of the battle. The bridge might have been taken or bypassed, and then an easy jaunt into Sharpsburg would cut off Lee, and the war is going to end. So we have been led to believe in some cases. And what a difference that would be, right? Burnside's the hero. McClellan's the hero, right? Maybe we don't get Grant at that point as president. Certainly, probably not. In my opinion, I don't think he gets that far if the war ends right now. But what a different course of events should this have happened. But the defense of the bridge would be difficult to overcome, and the attackers would need to refit after being spent in these efforts. The terrain leading from the bridge to the town would be difficult to traverse, high ground being utilized by Lee in his final defense line. So it is not going to be easy to assault. As it was, though, it would be a close-run thing. Finally forming up, the 9th Corps troops would pressure the brigades under Jones, including Kemper's and Garnett's Virginians, and Drayton's mixed command. Wilcox, Sturgis, and Rodman would form this final attack. There would be heroics, including Montgomery Corse and his efforts to delay the assault. Think, too, though, that Sturgis, you're already having spent a lot of your command, right? Wilcox has been kind of held in reserve here. Rodman's men have marched out to Snavely Ford and at least been skirmishing, so they've been marching as well. So just the fact that these troops are going to be tired, or they're not going to be 100%, is also going to lead into this ineffectual final action. With the timely arrival of A.P. Hill's command, then the defenders are still going to need to stand until they could be fully deployed. Jones's command would be pushed back to the town itself, artillery being used against the oncoming enemy. The 9th New York Hawkins Zouaves would be leading the way up the high ground. We do have an account of their attack. The practice of the rebel artillerymen was something wonderful in its accuracy. They dropped shot and shell right into our lines repeatedly. They kept the air fairly filled with missiles of almost every variety, from shrapnel to railroad iron. The shrapnel canister was very much in evidence. I saw one of our men in hospital afterward who had 9 gunshot wounds in his right forearm. I watched solid shot and round shot strike with what sounded like an innocent thud in front of the guns, and bounding over battery and park, fly through the tree tops, cutting some of them off so suddenly that it seemed to me they lingered for an instant, undecided which way to fall. These round shots did not appear to be in a hurry. They came along slow and deliberate, apparently, and there appeared no harm in them until they hit something. I was lying on my back, supported by my elbows, watching the shells explode overhead, and speculating as to how long I could hold up my finger before it would be shot off, for the very air seemed full of bullets. When the order to get up was given, I turned over quickly to look at Colonel Kimball, who had given the order, thinking he had become suddenly insane, never dreaming that he intended to advance in that fire, and firmly believing that the regiment would not last 1 minute after the men had got fairly on their feet. Sure enough, there was Kimball, looking all right. He repeated the order, "Get up the 9th," and I thought, looked directly at me. We got up and went forward, pressing at once into the cornfield. The men over which my men were swarming was at that moment knocked down by a shell. From the corn we crossed over a meadow, then over a strip of plowed land, and another piece of grass. We halted twice, I think, to rest and dress the line, although dressing was not necessary, as every man was in his place. The loss was frightful. I could see the regiment, the line shortening perceptibly as we advanced. We could hear the crash of the missiles through the ranks, and strange as it may seem, that sound brought like a flash into my mind a laying of lanes when describing the Battle of Austerlitz. I could hear the bones crash in my division like glass in a hailstorm. The charge ended, so far as I was concerned, in what appeared to be a grand finale. We had been advancing over what I remember as rolling, but at the same time rising ground. We had reached what looked like the summit of this particular ridge, where we were met by what I remember a crashing volley of musketry. We all went down together, although I was hit not with a bullet, but with a grape shot. The front of the companies held at that time became so narrow, I found myself right at the colors. The companies did not average, I think, above 12 or 15 men each at that stage. When I recovered myself after I fell, that is, got into position to see around me, and after the men had passed over me, some stumbling over, others stepping on me, which occupied but a moment, nearly everybody was down on the ground. The whole color guard lay prone, the colors on the ground. One or two of the men staggered to their feet and reached for the colors, but were shot down at once. Then there was what seemed to be a spontaneous rush for them by a dozen or more men, from several companies, who were shot down in succession, as each one raised his flag. One of these men who I noticed was Lieutenant Myers, was hit just as he picked one up. The flags were up and down, several times in a minute. The bear at last seized one of them, and swinging around his head was profane in the first and only time, I think, shouting to his company, "Up, damn you, forward!" I could see only toward the right of the line as I lay. I saw 4 commissioned officers in front of the line, Kimball, Horner, Libier, and McKinney, all shouting forward as men sprang to their feet. So it gives us a couple of things to take away from this assault. One of the things that I do want to mention, the 9th New York is a particularly harrowing case in the Battle of Antietam in a situation where we have a day-long battle with so many casualties, and there's so many regiments who probably deserve their shout-out in the narrative, and I don't necessarily think I did a very good job. So that's one of the reasons why I just kind of wanted to read this quote here from the 9th New York. And just seeing the ground in which they had to assault is very telling. If you go there, you're kind of like looked straight down this very steep hill. And if you're taking fire from not only these Confederate forces that have been scrambled and put together, but also one of the unsung things that we tried to mention, I think, in the narrative as well, is that the Confederate artillery actually does a pretty good job. Oftentimes we're talking about how ineffectual the fire of the Confederate artillery is, how the Union is superior in their artillery. Well, there are instances throughout the war where their gunners are going to be good veteran gunners who are going to know these weapons and use them to great effect. And this is going to be one such instance in this battle where it's either they're checking the men who are going to try to get through the sunken road sector, or it's going to be here where artillery is going to be used in lieu of having a strong infantry force to deal with these attackers. So I think we get that in this quote as well. The Georgians would reform and attack the oncoming brigades from Rodman, including heavy casualties on the 8th Connecticut. Rodman is going to be mortally wounded as a result. A.P. Hillsman would likewise arrive, some of whom were wearing captured uniforms from Harper's Ferry. They too would get into the fighting, throwing themselves on the 9th Corps. This would be where the 16th Connecticut would suffer heavily, them being an inexperienced regiment that happened to be on the flank of this attacking column. Lawrence O'Brien Branch would also be killed during this fighting, as A.P. Hill would find himself thrown in behind the attacking 9th Corps, hitting them in the flank and the rear. Therefore, we have the 9th New York in the head of the column getting into Sharpsburg almost. The final assault will come to naught, though. Burnside is going to realize that time had finally run out, and that with the stabilizing of the sector, the Battle of Antietam is going to draw to a conclusion. So I think we now have successfully gone back to the overlooked section of the Battle of Antietam. During the time of the battle, it was sort of overlooked as well, being a kind of sideshow for the main Union attacks once again in the cornfield and the sunken road. And then obviously you have the East Woods as well. So you have these other places that are on the battlefield that are going to be seeing some more focused attention by the Union Army. And so it's kind of fitting in this sense now. In a contemporary sense, it was, of course, that way. And then in this sense, we kind of overlooked it as well. But we've gone back and we've rectified it, hopefully, to talk more in depth about this action here at Burnside's Bridge. In particular, I think we need to pay lip service in this event to the role that the initial stand at Burnside's Bridge plays to the overall outcome of the battle. 300 Georgians will last 5 hours and withstand 5 assaults by the enemy to not only protect the right flank of Lee, but also allow for reinforcement in the form of A.P. Hill and an escape route, importantly, back to Virginia after the battle. And with that, I think we're going to leave the episode there. We successfully revisited Antietam. Next time, we are going to talk cavalry. We need to focus on 2 main figures in gray and have an analysis for them in Jeb Stuart and Nathan Bedford Forrest. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted it in the description, show a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns, the email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.